Ellie, are you a student, by the way? No.
No, I'm clinging on to the youth part of Youth and Student, I'm afraid. But I'm turning 26 this year, so I feel like I've got until my birthday in October to pass on the reins to someone else who can definitely be a bit more in loop with the student side of things. But you know,
I didn't realise, but 27 is like quite a big age, isn't it? Like my brother just turned it and he was like, oh my God, I need to buy a house. Like ASAP. He was like, I
can assure you I'm not thinking like that.
Afford to buy a house at 27.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got 35 participants so far. Just to say to the participants that you have come to the right place if you're hoping for a session on the Future Generations Act and the peace movement, and we will wait a little bit longer because I think people are still coming in. So yeah, do carry on your chat. I just wanted people to know, just in case they thought they crashed the wrong meeting.
There's a conversation about house prices.
And why not?
No, I mean, yeah, that's cool. How come you got involved in this, Ellie?
What with CND? I've probably been involved for it started when I was a student. When I was 6 years ago, that was when it made sense. Yes, I went to Goldsmiths Uni and set up a CND society there, and then just got really involved with CND and worked for London Region CND for a little bit, making events and things to try and get the cause out to students based in London. So it was really fun. And then obviously now work at Big Issue, linking it up. I still do a lot of so I sit on CND's National Council and Youth and Students Committee, so I'm still doing lots of stuff.
Okay, I think we're going to make a start because my introduction can take up some time as well. So I want to welcome everybody to this meeting this evening. I'm Caroline Lucas, the Green MP for Brighton Pavilion and your chair for this evening. And I also have the honour of chairing Parliamentary CND and of co-sponsoring with Lord Bird the Future Generations Bill in Parliament. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to explore how a Wellbeing for Future Generations Act could play a vital role in creating a more peaceful world. So many thanks to the organisers and to everyone who's here online so far. We have 3 brilliant speakers tonight. Priya Shivaram, who is the Parliamentary Research Analyst at the Big Issue. Jane Davidson, who's an author and former minister and the architect of the really pioneering Welsh Future Generations Act. And Ellie Kinney, who is co-convenor of Youth and Student CND. And just by way of setting the context, I guess I want to say how exciting I think the potential impact of a Future Generations Bill really is. And I'm so grateful to everyone who is working on the proposals and the campaign. I think it's difficult to think of a single recent piece of legislation or policy that wouldn't have been better if we had had a UK Future Generations Act already in law. The idea that we should run our economy and society in ways that meet the needs of future generations, that meet the needs of present generations, but without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That idea, of course, has been around for decades. But in spite of that, what we actually see in governments is basically a kind of pathological short-term thinking. And that is really the norm. Ministers, frankly, struggle to think 5 months ahead, let alone 5 years or 50 years or even 500 years. To give just one painful and very topical example of the problems of short-termism, it's often fatal when it's combined with siloed thinking. And we see that when we see how governments around the world really have ignored the warning from scientists about the links between the destruction of nature and the risk of pandemics. That has been ignored for far too long. People for far too long continued to facilitate the exploitation of the natural world for raw materials and industrial agricultural expansion, for instance, refusing to rein in unsustainable trade and ever-increasing consumption. And why? Well, because that's apparently what's good for the economy in the short term. And too often that trumps what's good for people and good for nature, both now and in the long term. Now, of course, the Future Generations Bill isn't a panacea. We need to fundamentally redesign our economy as well, taking inspiration, for example, from the Wellbeing Economics Government Group and the cities who are embracing so-called donut economics. But it's certainly part of the answer. And there are also many lessons that we can learn from Wales to build on their success and to develop the legislation further. So the bottom line is that decisions that ministers make today will shape our country and the lives of people for decades to come, centuries to come in some cases. Decisions on economic recovery policies and spending, of course, but also spending and decisions on Trident as well. Nuclear weapons have always been an immoral and monstrous use of money and resources. The case for disarmament in light of COVID is stronger than ever. Right before our eyes, we're seeing armed conflict and flows of arms prevent or subvert the public health measures that are required to control pandemics. As a new report entitled Assuring Our Common Future sets out, good public health systems, science and evidence-based policies, international cooperation, informed civil society and peace. Those are the so-called weapons to combat pandemics, not guns and not bombs. Now, alongside other MPs, I'm calling for the government's Defence and Security Review to set out a timetable for entering the Trident nuclear weapons system into multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations and developing economic conversion options to protect jobs. And it's this type of just transition that should be part of the UK's green recovery. We've heard the Prime Minister talk about green recovery and even mention occasionally intergenerational justice, but so far the Treasury has doubled down on business as usual and continued to bail out the polluters. Young people are at the forefront of the campaigns for a transformative Green New Deal, yet they're being offered a bargain basement imitation with none of the necessary boldness or vision or resource. Well, together we can and we will change that. And all the evidence suggests that the public are far ahead of governments in their support for a transformative shift to a fairer, greener and kinder future. I think the forthcoming budget is a real opportunity. Things are tough, but let's remember that big change can and does happen, sometimes unexpectedly. Tipping points exist in society as well as in climate systems. Just last week, the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force. 52 countries have ratified it. A further 86 have signed it. And a significant majority of the UK public want our government to sign as well. This treaty is a historic victory for grassroots campaigning, for the anti-nuclear movement and for future generations. It gives us a sense of what's possible. And at the start of a year that's already so painful for so many, where so much is at stake and we have so much to win, let's hold on to that for a pretty inspiring start. So in just a moment, I'm going to hand over to Priya to tell us more about the Future Generations Bill campaign. But just before I do, I just want to remind people that if you want to ask questions, please do enter those into the Q&A box on the side of your screen, hopefully, and then we can pick those up towards the end. So after we've heard from each of our three speakers, then we will certainly pick up those questions. So do enter them then. And if you want to put something in the chat box, please feel free to do that. But without further ado, let me hand the floor to Priya. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. And obviously, thank you, CND, for having me on the panel today. To give you context, I'm a parliamentary researcher in Lord Bird's office, and I've been working on this bill since August 2019, when John's team originally began drafting it, or I guess, should I say, adapting it, given it's no secret that what inspired our team was the equivalent Welsh Act, passed all the way back in 2015, largely thanks to Jane, and also because, you know, Wales seemed to be pioneers. To understand the context of the UK-wide bill, though, John's explained to me that the reason that he was so impressed by this legislation was because it seemed to be solving this problem that he kept encountering when once he joined the Lords. This problem was that he kept noticing, and he loves to quote this figure, that he was seeing that around 70% of government's time was being spent dealing with like the immediate relief of problems versus their cure or prevention. And obviously, being the founder of the Big Issue, he'd obviously been dealing with the symptoms of poverty for like 27 years at that point. So that begged this question of like, why hadn't other laws addressed these issues? And were these problems sometimes caused by the unintended consequences of previous legislation? The obvious answer, of course, is that on too many occasions, democracy is built on this process of short-termism. And given that humans have this like natural tendency to discount the future, as I'm sure we all know from some experience with procrastination, and this has led to many a crisis, you know, given like we can see in our country alone, there's like climate change, mental health problems. So yeah, but to me personally, I feel like this pandemic's kind of given this bill meaning, although obviously, admittedly, it's slightly annoying as it's made the dates for second readings and committee stages quite unpredictable and slippery. But it's given meaning because it's emphasised that, you know, the problems of tomorrow will soon become the problems of today if we fail to prepare for them. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but, you know, like the government apparently scrapped a team of senior ministers who were charged with preparing the country for a pandemic 6 months before the outbreak of coronavirus in the UK. And as we've seen recently, once we're in this crisis, we become a lot more reactive and we have like less control over outcomes. Historically, you know, I mean, given this is the CND, you know, I feel like I should just briefly run through why I think the UK bill will be really instrumental to peace, as I'm sure that's what you guys really care about. So yeah, like over history, I feel like there's been two main causes of like war, if we can bucket it. So it's been like finite resources and like ideology. So to address the first, you know, I think it's fair to recognize that, you know, like wars over finite resources are kind of becoming less common because like value and money and power increasingly comes through knowledge with like technology advancements instead of land as it used to. However, you know, in the past couple of decades, we have seen there have still been wars fought over this desire for like oil. And, you know, looking forward, there's projected to be wars due to climate change, you know, as land becomes uninhabitable, it makes mass migration more likely and harvests are becoming, you know, harder, and that makes famine more likely. But that's where this bill comes in, as it makes, you know, it puts this emphasis, it shines a light on environmental well-being. And as we react faster and we transition to the circular economy, we try to mitigate the effects of climate change, all of that, you know, should hopefully become less likely. Now on the ideology side, like what is ideology? I guess it's this like core set of beliefs that, you know, we all root around. And I think, you know, in the UK especially, right, we've never really had a written constitution. So I think the process, which this bill ensures, you know, once enacted, we'll have this like national consultation on what, on something so core and human and raw as like what well-being means to all of us. I feel that that could really give us something to like identify with, like these sets of beliefs and what we're all striving towards. And you know, in Wales, for example, like goal number 7 is to be globally responsible. And that, you know, if it's mirrored in the UK, it would naturally make quite an unlikely option. But obviously recognizing that peace requires global cooperation. And, you know, I like to think that if this bill was enacted in the UK, it would follow suit. You know, lots of countries would follow suit as they see that this kind of legislation is possible. And it's always hardest, obviously, to be the first mover, but as Wales has so bravely taken the first step, I think it is time that the UK follows suit. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that, Priya. And you've teed up Jane beautifully now. So we'll pass to Jane Davidson, who, just to remind anybody who has only just joined us, was the architect of the Pioneering Act in Wales. So Jane, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Caroline, and it was brilliant to hear from you, Priya. And I always try and take every pause in a parliamentary process as an opportunity to gather more supporters. So let's see how many supporters we can get behind Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for the UK by May. But hello everybody on the call. I'm delighted to join you here this evening. I was privileged to spend 12 years of my life in the National Assembly, one of the first Assembly members in 1999. And we came in Wales, uniquely in Wales, not in Scotland and Northern Ireland, with this duty to promote sustainable development in everything we did. And it was a brilliant duty. And I was really proud of all those people in Parliament who'd actually put that into the Government of Wales Act, because effectively the Government of Wales Act is our written constitution in Wales. And so in our written constitution, we had a commitment to sustainable development. But if you just have a commitment to promote something and you don't define it, even though, as Caroline did at the beginning, you know, she used the Brundtland definition of sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. If you don't define it, nobody knows how to do it. And I spent, you know, a long time, both as an education minister and then as the minister responsible for delivering this thing, trying to get the civil service, trying to get others to get behind, you know, what this was. And it became clear to me around about 2009, when I got the whole cabinet. Now, for those of you who are not involved in politics, you know, the cabinet, they're top people in government, the actual government, the politicians in government. I got the cabinet to agree to make sustainable development the central organising principle of government. And I thought my job was done. And I sort of sat back expecting, you know, the world to kind of like shift on its axis in Wales and, you know, suddenly we'd all become sustainable. And in fact, virtually nothing happened. And I realized that actually making the commitment, the political commitment, is not enough. And, you know, we hear a lot of rhetoric from politicians, and there'll be people who will say that they've heard a lot of rhetoric from me that hasn't been delivered over the years as a politician as well. But there's a real difference between what you want to achieve and not having the mechanism to do it, and saying things that you never intend to do. And for me, it became really a matter of obstinacy, that if I had to find a way while I was a politician to make this principle that we all agreed with, it wasn't something that we didn't agree with. We all thought it was great that Wales had this duty on sustainable development, and we all wanted to see it happen. And therefore it became absolutely my passion, since I decided to leave the National Assembly in 2011 anyway, that before I left, we would have a mechanism for delivery. So the last bomb I left, or as we prefer to call it now, the B bomb, the bomb that generates ecological change. The last bomb I left before I left government was to get my party, the Labour Party in Wales, to agree to propose what is now the Future Generations Act. And I've put the link to the kind of key information about the Act in the chat, because I kind of have a belief that after 6 o'clock, don't use slides, because so I'm not using slides. But Priya referred to one of the goals, and I did think it would be useful just to highlight a couple of things about the Welsh legislation, so that hopefully people on the call will see this is something worth fighting for. These very ideas are worth fighting for. So the Act has two key components. It has 7 goals. And for example, now prosperity in Wales is defined as innovative, productive and low carbon within the limits of the global environment. That's in law. And also in law, it's about developing a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment, allowing people to take advantage of wealth generated through securing decent work. That's in law. So suddenly, you know, the coal mine in Cumbria couldn't be opened in Wales in the context of a low carbon society. It also, in these goals, a resilient Wales, which I'd much prefer to call a nature goal, is about enhancing biodiversity in the context of climate change. A healthier Wales is not about targets on the NHS, but where you understand people's physical and mental well-being and you maximise it. A more equal Wales is about people fulfilling their potential no matter what their background or circumstances, including socioeconomic background and circumstances. Cohesive communities, attractive, viable and safe. A Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, promoting and investing in those things that makes Wales Wales. And a globally responsible Wales. And I'll just read this out because I think the point that Priya made is absolutely critical. A globally responsible Wales is a nation which, when doing anything to improve the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, takes account of whether doing such a thing may make a positive contribution to global well-being and the capacity to adapt to change, for example, climate change. Now, these are not just goals in a piece of paper, they're actually in the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act. And the public services in Wales that are responsible to the Welsh Government and charged with delivering on them have to work in 5 prescribed ways as well. So what is being achieved? Those goals need to be achieved. How you achieve them, you do it by demonstrating your thinking long term, your thinking preventatively, you integrate the goals, you collaborate with others to achieve it, and you involve people about whom decisions are being made. And within the system, in terms of holding the government public services to account, I mean, personally, I believe that the very existence of the Act enables people to hold their government and public services to account. But in Wales, they're assisted by a Future Generations Commissioner, by an Auditor General for Wales, who audits all the bodies and is required to change the audit system to do that. And then if those mechanisms don't work, there's also the courts. So there is a mechanism here, but as I said, in the context of the protection of the Welsh language, for example, that's what demonstrates it's a very Welsh law created by the people of Wales, for the people of Wales, by the people of Wales. And I think the big principles, which are the ones that can be carried over into any legislation anywhere in the world, are actually about the idea that we have dropped the problems. As politicians, I feel guilty, even though I have never, ever made a decision in my political life that has created a problem, I hope, for the next generation. My generation of politicians has done all of that. They've downloaded nuclear waste, so that can be paid for or dealt with elsewhere. They've downloaded the issues around nuclear armaments. They've downloaded the public finance initiative, the private finance initiative, which puts extra costs on people down the line. They've done the same with university fees in terms of people having to pay. So what we do at the moment in politics is we react short term and we shove the problems downline. And now what this act does is says, you can't do that anymore. You've got to pick up the problems and deal with them now. But we're not telling you how to do it. What we're doing is telling you what you have to take into account, what the values framework is that you must operate to. And that, I think, in many ways is the strength of the Act, because it doesn't say that if you're a Conservative, you have to change your whole policies around anything. What it would say is, as a Conservative, you might do it this way, but we ask you to look at future generations and take them into account in every decision. And we ask every other party to do that as well. And in a sense, it's almost exactly the same as the treaty that has been signed in the context of the UN. So everybody can sign up to this if they believe in this. And just one thing to finish on before there are questions and comments later. I mean, my book, I've got to advertise the book just because the publishers will insist I do so, which tells the story of Future Gen. But I mean, for anybody who can't afford that, I'll put the link onto my website where there's lots of webinars about it and discussions. And also there's lots of material on the website where people can understand the journey that has been taken in Wales. And what I'm hoping that just as Wales was first on carrier bags and the rest of the UK followed within 4 years, and I'm proud to be the carrier bag woman, but you'd never know that, because nobody ever credits Wales with what we did on carrier bags. But actually, it doesn't matter where the credit lies. It's whether or not we can persuade enough people that actually looking after future generations has to be the core element of all our politics. Because after all, what else would we do? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. That's really, really eloquent and powerful. And just to reinforce, it's a brilliant book. So if people do want to get hold of it, it's really readable and really, really interesting. So thank you for that. And now we're going to move to Ellie Kinney, co-convenor of Youth and Student CND, who will talk a little bit more, I guess, about how the bill relates more directly to peace and disarmament. So Ellie, thank you so much.
Thank you. So firstly, I just wanted to say a really massive thank you to all the speakers so far. So I actually work for The Big Issue. I'm a fundraiser for the Big Issue Foundation. So when I first heard about this campaign at work, I really wanted to get involved and see how two campaigns with CND can connect. So thank you all so much for your contributions. So when I first got involved with CND, my passion for getting rid of this country's nuclear weapons was largely based around sort of my moral standpoint alongside an obvious economic point. At that point, we were nearly at the end of the coalition Cameron-Clegg government, about 4 years into savage cuts into public services, and food bank use was at a then record high. I found it absolutely unthinkable that the government would choose to maintain and renew their nuclear weapons system when families were starving as a direct result of austerity. Little did we know how much the impact of these years of austerity on both society and our NHS would have when we found ourselves in the midst of a pandemic. And that's made me think a lot about the effects of short-term thinking in politics and where our government's priorities lie. In preparation for this little webinar, I was reading the government's National Risk Register from 2017. Don't do this, it's really depressing. In it presents the risk of an emerging infectious disease or a flu pandemic as a medium to high risk, and details how the government is apparently preparing for this situation to ensure minimum impact. We all know how that went. So the same document lists the risks of a large-scale nuclear attack, understandably, as medium to low risk. Now, this document I was reading was from 2017, just a year after Parliament voted to spend £206 billion on renewing Trident, our nuclear weapons system. And yet an investigation by Channel 4 found that at the start of the pandemic, 45% of the UK's PPE stockpile was out of date. A higher risk faced this country and was deemed more likely to occur than a nuclear attack, and yet the government did not think to plan or prepare for the future, instead wasting valuable resources on funding an outdated weapons system. Well, what were they thinking? And to me, this is exactly the problem. It feels like they weren't thinking, or if they were thinking, they were thinking with their egos on the global stage or thinking with the opinion polls. Far too often, it feels to me, politicians are not thinking about the well-being of future generations in mind. So when I heard about John Bird and Caroline Lucas leading this bill through Parliament, I thought, well, that's fantastic. A chance to force politicians to think long-term about their actions, not simply to the next election or the next budget. A chance to force conversations on the issues that will affect those growing up now or those yet to be born, on the social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts of their actions. Imagine if shouting to be heard, young people were instead given a voice in Westminster and could allow for a fully formed discussion around the impacts that nuclear weapons have on us and the generations yet to come. For example, consider the social and cultural impact of being one of only 9 countries globally which hold nuclear weapons over the rest of the planet. While the UK is very much getting used to being a global embarrassment thanks to the Tory government's handling of this pandemic, we've missed an opportunity to try and redeem ourselves and lead on creating a more peaceful planet. Last week, as has already been mentioned, the UN International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force, making the creation, ownership and deployment of nuclear weapons illegal in the 51 countries who signed the treaty. What was an opportunity to create lasting peace and stability was instead ignored by the UK and by other nuclear powers across the planet. Our inability to work in partnership on an issue that's plagued international relations for decades risks leaving behind a country that is detached from our international counterparts, rather than being a leading member of the international community. Secondly, you can consider the economic impact of Trident on future generations. Even before the pandemic, CND has been campaigning about prioritising funding the NHS over warfare, and we now find ourselves with an underfunded healthcare system stretched to breaking point because of COVID-19. If the £206 billion ring fence for Trident had instead been redirected to councils, public housing or the NHS, we could have started to repair the damage caused by a decade of cruel cuts to essential services, and we could have started to build on long-term stability. But now we face an even bigger crisis as we start to see the scale of economic damage caused by, as we start to see how the scale of the economic damage caused by the pandemic will be handled. Unlike spending on houses or on schools, spending money on Trident has no ultimate economic benefit and therefore passes nothing positive on to future generations that I can see. I can think of so many things I'd rather my grandchildren and their grandchildren inherit than this costly and out-of-date weapons system. We could take on the housing crisis and build over 650,000 new homes for the cost of Trident. We can invest in education and creating jobs that will be so vitally needed on the other side of this pandemic. And right now, we simply cannot afford to waste £206 billion on nuclear weapons, burying our heads in the sand while we continue to pass on crises after crisis to the next generation. And speaking of crisis, with the youth climate strike shaking up local politics and activists like Greta Thunberg playing a huge role in showing politicians exactly how it's done, young people deserve to know the environmental impact of the submarines patrolling our shores. Their production alone creates risks. The hazardous substances used to create these weapons often find their way into our rivers, our oceans and soil. In the event of an attack, even a small-scale war with these weapons will cause irreparable global damage, accelerating climate change and leaving the planet with a temperature crash and soil incapable of growing crops for about 5 years. Through our commitment to nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction, we're risking not even leaving behind a planet inhabitable for future generations. Now, I'm really aware how bleak this is. We're in the middle of a pandemic and there's absolutely no reason to go around dropping terms like mutually assured destruction. But if the well-being of the future generations bill would force all of these issues to be considered, then I think that offers a much more hopeful future than what we currently face. Not just through this pandemic, but through the last decade of austerity, we've gotten so used to the politics of excuses, of despair and of disappointments, and of simply just not doing enough to protect the vulnerable in society. The future of young people simply hasn't been protected yet. But it's not too late, and I do think that we can change this. We can replace this with a politics of optimism and a politics of hope, and of leaving behind a world that we're happy for our grandchildren to inherit, knowing that they can live their safe and full lives, with a society ready for whatever might be chucked at them. Young people have been shouting louder than ever about the issues that affect them, and I think it's time that they're finally listened to. Has Caroline Lucas disappeared?
Hi everyone, I'll just take over from CND for a while. Oh, hang on, do we have Caroline? Yes, we've got Caroline. Can we hand back to you?
I am so sorry about that. I lost the last bit of Ellie. My reception is not great this evening. I do apologize, but what I did hear was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much, Ellie. It was really powerful. So questions, and let me just get them back up on my screen. So the first question was from Rebecca Warren, who was asking about how we use the bill, the act, to hold Boris Johnson to account, because she reminds us that in fact he had pledged, I think, to the big issue that this is something that he really cared about and he was going to do something about it. So I don't know, maybe Priya, whether you've got any ideas how we can really hold the Prime Minister to account on that. I mean, certainly what MPs can do is to raise it with him in Parliament. We've already had one debate on the Future Generations Bill in the Commons, and Lord Bird and Jenny Jones introduced it into the Lords. But certainly I think persuading MPs, what I would say from my experience in Parliament is we can certainly get MPs to try and ask questions and so forth. But Priya, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I guess it's just probably a good time to mention that so this month we've had our January campaign to try and promote the bill and try and get, there's a more public momentum around it. If you go onto our website todayfortomorrow.org.uk, we've got a little template you could write to your MP. So we've been running kind of ads in Broad Street national newspapers, which has got letters from children to decision makers, and this has all been trying to get MPs involved and get them to attend our Wellbeing Week, which has been running this week actually from Monday to Thursday, and it provided MPs to drop into a 5-minute Zoom session and chat to young ambassadors from our bill. just about the pertinent issues that are affecting future generations or that they forecast, and to kind of try and understand the relevance of the bill. And then as we're at the end of the session, we've been asking MPs whether they'd like to co-sign a letter to government, which is calling on the government to actually implement their own Wellbeing of Future Generations bill. So yeah, I mean, we've had a really good turnout. We've had like 65 MPs from 8 political parties show up, and a lot of enthusiasm. So hopefully, when we get that letter out, kind of try and jerk Boris Johnson into action. But yeah.
Yeah, well, really congratulations, Priya, on everything that the Big Issue's been doing, because that Today for Tomorrow campaign, I think, has really resonated. And to have that many MPs take part at a time when there's so much else going on, I think is a real testament to the fact that there is a lot of cross-party support for this. And in terms of sponsorship of the bill, there are Conservatives who are sponsoring it, which is brilliant. So there is cross-party support. And I think the more we can maybe get young people themselves to contact the Prime Minister and just shame him into some action. But I was going to come to Jane and Ellie just to see if you had any points to add on that.
I think there's two things I'd probably add. The first one is that it's really important that this remains a cross-party initiative, because if you're going to create law by one party, then what happens at the next election is there is a manifesto commitment to undo it. And I think that in the context of protecting future generations, it absolutely needs to be a cross-party initiative. And so it's really helpful that Boris Johnson did sign that election pledge. That is at the very least a squeak of embarrassment for him if he carries on maintaining his current position. But I don't think it needs to be done in an aggressive way. I think it's how many young people and others can you get to talk to their MPs, and how many of their MPs then persuade the cabinet, and how many members of the cabinet then persuade the Prime Minister. And just think of that same process in every one of those 8 political parties. Because in a sense, what you want is the leaders of those political parties to feel that acting in this way would improve their public standing, create more trust in the electorate in terms of what they're doing, and give the electorate more confidence that the government was looking after them for the long term, not the short term. Because the COVID issue has meant that government has been the most short term in the whole of my life. I mean, actually, decisions haven't even lasted a morning in some senses, let alone lasting a generation, which is where we're going with this. And I think I should also say that for the purposes of the Welsh Act, a generation is 25 years. And I think that it's useful to have a concept of that, because that's 5 parliamentary sessions, with 5-year terms. It's not 5 years. It's not just the next parliamentary session. It's 5 parliamentary sessions. So I think that is the first point. And I think the second point is just don't underestimate the value of public opinion with this particular government. I mean, they spend a lot of time polling on public reaction. I can say probably quite politically in this context that there's no way that Boris Johnson would be in Scotland today if he wasn't worried about the Scottish polling. So what we want to achieve is the fact that actually it's in everybody's interests to have a piece of legislation around future generations, because what it does is give you the values framework. It's the same for all parties. If you can have a values framework where you can look people in the eye and say, because of this, I'm not going to allow a coal mine. I am going to get rid of that gas at the first available opportunity because it's a fossil fuel. I am going to take money out of that and put it into nature. And it's very, very hard for traditional politicians and traditional processes to do those things. And without a values framework that they've signed up to, but if they've got it, it makes it a lot easier. And all those aspects that I contributed in terms of the Welsh Act that word peace isn't in there. But there is a Heddwch Academy. Heddwch is the word for peace in Wales. There is a Heddwch Academy, and that academy feels very strongly that the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act gives them the permission to actually drive a peace agenda as well.
Lovely, thanks so much, Jane. I think all of those comments are really, really well made, and it is so important that this is a cross-party campaign, and it certainly will stay that way. Ellie, it's hard to go last. Sorry, I'll come to you first next time. Is there anything that you would like to add in terms of what else has been said?
I think, to be honest, obviously just incredible points made so far. We do have really the experts in the room. I think one thing that's noticeable as like a lay person in all of this is that one thing that's been hugely missing out of politics at the moment is accountability, whether that's in a really short-term sense or in a longer-term sense. So, if the one positive thing to come out of the pandemic is that it's a wake-up call for the wider population to really get behind campaigns like this and use that momentum to really drive it forward, because we know what it's like now to not have things left in a good way for you. We know what it's like to be in a really difficult end of things. And I think we all could probably safely say that we don't want our grandchildren to, live through a year like 2020.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so our next question comes from Tom Cuthbert, who sadly rightly predicts, I fear, that young people will be losing their jobs in huge numbers because of COVID as this year goes on. And he's asking what we can do about it, and I guess by extension, in what way the bill could help that. I'm going to come to you first again, Ellie, just because you did touch on this very powerfully in your opening comments when you were talking about that huge amount of money that is going wasted on Trident that could be used for jobs. But is there anything else you'd like to say just on that particular connection?
Well, I think like one thing that I've found particularly interesting during this pandemic is that, well, I suppose prior to the pandemic, the argument that was often made by trade unions or people, a lot of people, especially in like the sort of labour movement, is the kind of the jobs element. You can't rid these people of their jobs and the however many jobs it is that are reliant on the nuclear industry. But the incredible thing that happened during the pandemic was this UK ventilator challenge, where all of these highly skilled workers were able to put their energy and put their power into creating the essential, so very necessary ventilators that we didn't have enough of, which just shows how these are scientific minds and incredibly skilled workers, where there's such potential there to grow another industry, to create something that's not going to risk the future generations in the same way that nuclear weapons does, but actually is creating better science and better technology that we can pass on to future generations. So I think that's something that I found particularly important coming out of this pandemic, is just seeing really how skills can be changed and can be utilised. And if that is a big message for jobs not tried and coming out of this, then I think that's a good standpoint.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And Priya, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I read somewhere, that like, everyone talks about the pandemic, right? They're talking about like a green recovery, and that's so fantastic. And it's like it's obviously it's like the way forward. It's probably the long-term approach, because you want the people who are losing their jobs now to kind of be ready to take up jobs fit for the future. But I think that it kind of does require this like long-termism mindset to be thinking like that, because like the easy approach I kind of think would be just to quickly stimulate and prop up the parts of the economy that are kind of falling now. But in reality, like it kind of needs to be two-pronged. You do need to do that, because the people who will be losing their jobs now, they'll probably be the most expensive to retrain into the green economy, because they'll probably have incompatible skill sets. And I think like in our bill, we have this whole focus on preventative spending, where we try to classify departmental spending into these 4 categories, outlining when things are being done for this immediate relief and when things are being done with a long-term approach in mind. And I think having that kind of system in place will kind of incentivize behavior to be investing now into, for example, retraining, when that's probably the more expensive approach, for like, the long term, ensuring that these people can have jobs for like 25 years time.
Brilliant, thanks Priya. Jane, anything to add?
Just a couple of things. I think the first one is that what the budget will include will change completely if there's a focus on future generations. And the civil servants will have a very important role in that, because in a sense, they will make commentary on the way up to ministers as to whether or not whatever is being proposed does or does not assist that intergenerational approach. So in actual fact, I mean, and we're seeing that in Wales, and it's quite uncomfortable for ministers with pet projects to have, you know, in a sense, another lens through which these things are addressed. And therefore it will take some time while people get used to it. But what it does mean is, when you'll know, probably all of you in Wales on this call, that having a Future Generations Act in Wales and that value framework turned down the extension for the M4 and saved wetlands with international designations. And in actual fact, that outcome, without even the use of the Act, was down to the values framework. So it's the values framework that's the really important element in terms of changing where people will go and making big financial decisions. But just before this event, I was watching the BBC News, and there was an incredibly sad story about a young woman who had bought her first flat at the age of 27 and is bankrupt at the age of 28 because she bought in a flat in a set of flats which now is affected by the cladding issues post Grenfell. And it always comes back to me that when I first became a politician, and we're talking a very, very long time ago now, but you know, a local councillor in the 1980s, part of my job as that politician in the 1980s in a local council was about making sure that we had good building officers who would make sure that everything was safe. Local authorities used to have a critical role in terms of buildings being safe. And with the cuts to public services over the years, the outsourcing, that has gone in the way it once was. And we start to, you know, if we're thinking upstream, I came into politics because of poor housing. We need to start thinking about what keeps us safe and make sure that those mechanisms and that support is in place. So, you know, the Grenfell issue is self-evident, but it's all those other people who are affected now. And those are current and future generations, because of course it's the youngest people on their first step on the housing ladder who have now lost their jobs because of the pandemic, who will perhaps need to retrain in terms of other skills. So personally, it's got to be UBI, universal basic income, and a 4-day week. So there are kind of suggestions that you can immediately put if you have a new framework in which to attest that. And we know that with the development of AI and the way that's used in the context of manufacturing, we know we don't need people in the same places in the same way as we have done in the future. So the whole idea for me behind the Future Generations Act is it also changes the way in which we can think about some of these other areas.
Brilliant, thank you, Jane. And as you speak, it comes really clear, I think, that in a sense, offering this, as you call it, a values framework, which I think is a really powerful way of thinking about this, but offering that forward to ministers and government is actually a very helpful thing to do in a sense. It gives them some parameters and some criteria against which to make some of these very difficult decisions that they face. I just wanted to give a shout out, actually. I was just looking down the chat. Valerie Woodgager has a message to panelists here, and just in case people haven't had a chance to read it, she says that she will be 80 in July. So the urgency of all you're doing means a lot to me, for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And she goes on to say that she's the founder of Learn with Grandma Wales. Its first aim is to protect and cherish our people, our community and our planet. It's our home. And secondly, it's to reunite the generations using IT as a bridge. All are welcome to use this platform to promote all that is good for our future. So yay, Valerie, that is just brilliant. There was a question that actually I'm going to come to Jane with first, just because I think it probably relates to the situation with the Commission in Wales. And this was a question from Brian Jones. And he asks, sorry, it's just disappeared. It has just disappeared. Anyway, what he asked was, why hasn't the Future Generation Commissioner, for example, in Wales, addressed the issue of nuclear? And in particular, he gave the example of the recent Welsh Government consultation on radioactive waste. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about which issues the Commissioner picks up, how they identify which issue to pick up, because they could, you know, there's so many areas in which their input could be usefully brought to bear. I wonder if you could say anything. I know you can't explain exactly that decision, but how does she in Wales prioritise?
Well, I could certainly say that the one of the complexities of devolution is that the Future Generations Commissioner only has authority on those issues that are in the responsibility of the Welsh Government. And in the delivery of those public services. So I don't know why in this particular circumstance, but I know that she is very keen to influence government on decisions within her parameters and has been very active and vocal in doing so. And if you go onto her site, I'll put that link up on the in the chat as well. She's actually done a big manifesto for the future, collecting evidence in terms of positive actions across the whole of Wales, some 800 pages in terms of actually helping people on the journey in terms of what to do. But I mean, I would suggest that you just contact the office herself and ask her why she hasn't done, because she's independent of all of us. She's independent of government, and she's independent of all of us as individual Welsh citizens as well. But I'll put her link in the chat so anybody could get in touch.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think what we can say, I'm sure, is that there would be no kind of other political reason for not picking this up. It seems like it's a really key linkage. And I don't know whether or not Ellie or Priya wants to say anything more about maybe just the general issue of the compatibility of nuclear power with a Future Wellbeing Act. Maybe Ellie, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I think as well, just I don't know whether this might as well also touch on the next question that I think Mary put in the chat about the possibility around like nuclear accidents and mistakes like that. And I think I tried to focus specifically on nuclear weapons sort of within what I was talking about, but when you get into nuclear power, like there's a lot going on there. And I think you can talk about kind of putting forward just sort of greener energy. And I think obviously that's massively important, but if it's only green for the time that it's, you know, creating energy and then you have a lot to deal with afterwards, but it's simply not your problem, I don't think that's a really, really helpful way forward. And especially forcing people to think, you know, 25 years ahead about, you know, and longer than that, and what's going to happen with the various forms of waste and like decommissioning and this kind of thing. I think that's a really essential conversation to be having.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you for picking up Mary's question as well about the issue of nuclear accidents or mistakes. And I think I would just say, so Mary's question was, why doesn't CND highlight the very real possibility of nuclear accidents or mistakes? And kind of in my experience that they have done pretty much. They could always do more, I guess, but I think it's absolutely key to saying that this is part of the whole risks that go alongside nuclear. But Priya, is there anything you would like to say on either the issue of nuclear waste, nuclear weapons, compatibility with the Future Generations Act?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know, I guess like the only thing is that our bill, I guess it's kind of been criticised for doing, like trying to do a little bit too much and being a bit too broad. So I guess taking on like nuclear as well may be a little bit, I don't know, politically hard to sell. It would be my only concern as to why it probably hasn't. But hey, we're redrafting in February, I guess. So yeah, like open to comments if that's.
There's nothing in the bill. I mean, the bill as it's drafted absolutely would certainly allow someone to bring a case to the commissioner to intervene on either nuclear weapons or nuclear waste. So in a sense, as Jane said, it's the commissioner has to account for the decisions they make, and she is independent. But there's absolutely no reason, I think, why we couldn't use this bill very effectively to raise all of those questions about, you know, the people that will really be kind of feeling the impact of decisions on both nuclear power and nuclear weapons are indeed the future generations. We're beginning to run out of time. We've only got 5 minutes left. I don't think I can see any more direct questions in the chat. I was maybe just going to explain a little bit about the process, because Priya, you explained that this was Wellbeing Week, and we were hoping that at the end of this week it'd be possible to present the private members bill, and well, it has been presented, but to have the second reading and to take it on its next step. As Jane alluded to, sadly with COVID, Jacob Rees-Mogg has taken it into his head that we're not going to have any more private members bills for a while. And obviously, I wasn't expecting that we would do it physically, but arguably it could have been done perfectly well remotely. But nonetheless, they will come back in May, and certainly, as you said, Priya, we will be looking again at how best to represent the bill, because basically you have to keep it alive. Each time there's a new session of Parliament, it has to be reintroduced. So what we can do is gather some of the feedback that we've been getting since it was first introduced in both the Lords and the Commons to make it even more robust and effective, and we will do that, and we'll certainly be reintroducing it into the Commons when the new session starts, and into the Lords. What we would love people to do, and they can do this right now, you don't need to wait until the revised bill comes back, but do contact your MPs, because as Jane said, I think the best way of changing the kind of the political culture around this is to get as many MPs from all parties to be talking about it. And certainly if your MP is an MP from the government party, that's an even better reason to go and lobby them too. And you can do that remotely. So MPs are holding surgeries electronically, even if you can't go physically. So yeah, write a letter, write an email, but even better, ask if you can sort of eyeball them face to face on a Zoom, and make the case that this is something that they should be supporting. And they will, if enough people make that case. As Jane said, that does filter upwards, and there's more of a chance that we can put enough pressure on government to move in this direction, because I don't see there's any kind of major ideological reason why they shouldn't. This could be a very helpful bill in many respects. So I would urge you all to do that. We've got 3 minutes left, which allows 1 minute each for my lovely panelists if there was any last thoughts that you wanted to give, which is a cruel thing to ask you because I didn't say I was going to do that. But Ellie, going back in reverse order, is there anything you would like to finish with?
I think just to add, really, I mean, so many incredible points have been made so far, and I think this bill provides, a really great opportunity to sort of change the way that we approach politics, and also change the voice that young people and people not yet born have in politics, which I think is absolutely vital. And I think as well, the impact of the pandemic kind of throws a whole different light on this bill and also on politics in general. And I think if that's kind of a momentum that everyone can capture as a result of a very difficult period, then I think that could really give us something special for the future.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Jane?
I just want to say that I really, really think that the bill is an opportunity for hope. And I think we all need a bit of hope. And I think it's hope for all generations. I mean, I know so many people of my age who have grandchildren or children who are struggling at the moment and who can't see much hope for them at the moment. And I think that a refresh of government in the context of taking this forward, and it's not political, to be interested in future generations. And of course, we'd want to tie it with climate as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Priya, you're going to have the last word.
Quite a lot of pressure. Just to echo, thank you everyone for their time. And it is my favorite thing about this campaign is, again, it shouldn't really be a politicized matter, and it hasn't seemed to be. So many MPs from all over the country, all political parties seem to be quite enthusiastic by this, but it does very much require constituents to kind of put the grind in and make the push, because they do really care when their constituents are telling them to. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to our amazing speakers. And taking part in meetings like this is brilliant, but it's even more brilliant if you can follow it up with an action. And if your action could be to write to your MP, and you'll have plenty of food for thought from the website. Priya, it's Today for Tomorrow, isn't it? Is that the name of the website? Today for Tomorrow.
.org.uk.
.org.uk. So it's 8 o'clock. Thank you so much to all of you for listening and for your comments and input. And thank you again to our speakers. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Caroline.